All right, so good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another Brightspace Lunch and Learn session. My name's Lachlan Kalish. I'm the Learning Innovation Lead in DLT. You may have seen me in some of the other PD for Brightspace, and I'm joined by other members of the project team today, including Kelly Boone, who will be chatting to you uh, via the chat panel if you're putting in questions that she can respond to there. Otherwise, I'll be stopping periodically and we can pick them up at that point. The Tuesday and Thursday lunch and learn sessions generally have a theme. So we focus in on particular areas of using Brightspace. And at the moment, all of the interest is in and around assessment and the gradebook. So today's session is looking at gradebook setup, understanding the gradebook a bit better, and potentially some tips and tricks in that space for you. Before I go any further, what I'm going to do is actually turn Teams off. I would hate to get inappropriate Teams posts in the middle of a session. And what I've done here is I've got a series of different subject sites that are running in 60, and I thought we might have a bit of a wander through their gradebook setups. And that way I can kind of demonstrate some different things for us to look at as we go. If you also have a gradebook that you would like me to look at throughout the course of this, I'm happy for you to just drop a subject code into the chat, etc., and I will have a look through them. I think where I would like to start is my first port of call always, where before I open up a gradebook, is to look at the subject outline. So it's important to kind of understand the relationship between the subject outline, our assessment portals that we create, and the columns that exist in the gradebook. So I usually start by opening up the subject outline in any given subject. I'm not picking on Ag 202, but I just happen to open that one up. I can see straight away that there are multiple cohorts in this subject. So my expectation is that we're going to have multiple sets of columns that have come from the subject outline as well. Let's open up the Wagga internal version of it. They've got 3 assessments. And usually, just because it's a force of habit for me, I take a snip using the snipping tool of the items in the subject outline so I can see due dates and percentages. So 3 columns, 2 cohorts, 3 assignments, 2 cohorts. I'm expecting there to be 6 columns that have come from the subject outline tool when it was published at week -2. And now I'm ready to open up my gradebook. So I'm going to go into my subject, my grades. And the first view that we get inside the Brightspace gradebook is this kind of sprawling across the page landscape thing, depending on the number of cohorts and the number of tasks. But basically, it requires I do a lot of scrolling across the page, which is not immediately helpful to me. So you may find it helpful to understand that we have our enter grades view, which is default across the page view, students down the left, columns over to the right, and we have manage grades. And to be fair, manage grades is where I spend most of my time if I'm looking at gradebook setup. So I'm going to click on manage grades because it will give me my top-down view of every column in the gradebook. And I can see straight away that there is a discrepancy here between columns which have come from the subject outline. And I can see these ones because they have the name of the cohort followed by a colon and then the name of the task. So we've got 3 for Wagga distance and 3 for Wagga internal. And we notice as well that there's this column over here called association, which means is this column connected to an assessment submission point or portal? And these ones are not. And if I scroll down, I can see assessments 1, 2, and 3 don't have anything about cohorts here at all. And they are associated with an assignment. So this tells me that what's happened in this case is the academic has created and published these assessments directly to the gradebook, creating 3 new columns worth 40, 40, 20. Okay, so that gives us our 100 points for the subject. But now we have all these excess columns which have come from the subject outline. And you may have found that that situation has happened for you as well. It seems to be a fairly common situation. But it's just worth looking at. And at the moment, the final calculated grade coming through here in this gradebook is 300 points. So 100 from the first lot and 100 for each of those other cohorts, which is not fantastic. So for me, I would want to tidy up this gradebook by deleting all of the superfluous columns. And it's a good thing that we're inside the Manage Grades area, because that is exactly what we can do in this space. If we click on More Actions, there is a delete option right here. And I can go in and check the columns that I want to get rid of all in the one hit. You'll notice that those 3 portals that we have down the bottom for assessments 1, 2, and 3, I can't select them. And that's because they've been associated with an assessment portal already. So if they're linked, I can't delete them, even by mistake. So at this point, what I'm going to do is get rid of all of the columns that came through from the subject outline. I can select them all and go delete. And the impact of doing that has now brought down our final calculated grade in this gradebook to 100 points, which is exactly what we want to see, because when the convener for this subject is wanting to do their grade transfer at the end of session, we need it to equal 100. Now, there are a few ways to get to that point, but this is the simplest one. Make sure that the columns that are in the gradebook add up to 100. That's our base scenario. So we've tidied this up. We have 3 submission portals, which are assignments. They have been published to the gradebook. They add up to 100 points. Okay, fantastic. At the moment, these items are in order: assessment 1, assessment 2, assessment 3. However, if yours are not, in that same More Actions area that we were doing the deleting in a minute ago, we also have the ability to reorder. If we click on reorder, it'll give me some numbers next to these, and then I can change this around. If I wanted number 2 to be there at the front, I can change those numbers, and it switches the order around that I will see them left to right. So you can use the reorder option to change the order of your columns. I'm going to change that back before the academic kills me, finds out I've been messing with their site. So let's go with that one being number 2 and hit save. So yes, you can adjust the order of the columns, but that does not include our final calculated and final adjusted grade. You'll notice that these are grayed out here. They are provisioned in every subject site. We cannot move them. Now, what else can we do inside our Manage Grades tab? Another question that we have often is, can I hide the columns? At the moment, these 3 columns are visible to students if they go into My Grades, regardless of if they have a score or not. They can just see A1 reflective essay, A2, A3, etc. If you want to hide the columns, you can do that in here as well. Hit the drop down next to it, and we've got hide from users. At that point, we get the eye icon saying that it's hidden, and students going into My Grades now would no longer see A1 reflective essay where they would currently probably have a 0 for the task, etc., or not completed. So you can hide the columns if you want to. Similarly, you can unhide them. So hiding columns, what else can we do? People often want to know how to add additional columns to the gradebook. And the usual scenario I get for this is they want a column to be able to put comments in to use for different purposes. And at that point, we can do that by going to New and Item. Item just being column. Now, the type of column that we want to add in this situation is a text column, and it is right down the bottom, text. So let's put in a column for text. Comments. Now, this might be comments around a particular assessment. It may be to do with moderation. It may be to do with special considerations. It can be related to anything. You can add as many additional columns as you like, call them whatever you like. And we've added in a text column. It's not going to have any impact on that final calculated grade. And at the moment, this column, when we create it, will be visible to the students. Now, if I want to hide it from the outset, I can in fact go across to this restriction section and hide from users. So I want my comments to be available to other academics, my other markers, my conveners, whatever else, whoever else has access to your gradebook, but I don't want the students to see it. So we click hide from users. And at that point, save and close. And we now have our comments column sitting there waiting for academic staff to use, but not for students to see. So those are some of the more common scenarios with editing columns within a gradebook. the ability to delete the superfluous ones, and to add in additional columns, particularly text where you need them. Those are fairly common needs that we have when working in the Brightspace Gradebook. If I jump back now from Manage Grades into Enter Grades, it's important that you know that we have two different views inside our gradebook when we're looking at the Enter Grades screen. The first one, which is called the standard view, that's what we're looking at here. I can click as many times as I like within these columns, and I cannot modify scores within them. So it's somewhat passive, this view. I have the option up here to switch to spreadsheet view because the gradebook is simply just a giant spreadsheet. And at that point, it opens up our direct entry or data entry mode. You'll see that I can now click within the cells and put in grades directly into the gradebook if I needed to. So it's an interesting scenario, I suppose. There are certain roles and subject types where direct entry into the gradebook is needed, and they do a lot of it. A lot of workplace learning subjects, for example, they're simply updating satisfactory, unsatisfactory type tasks, and they're doing it at scale, a lot of them all at once. So they would come in to these columns and simply update them. But otherwise, the intention is generally we grade our assessments inside the individual assessment tools. So in the assignment tool, we would evaluate in the assignment dashboard. If I brought that up here in another tab, we would expect your markers to be going into the assignment dashboard and going to evaluate individual student submissions, providing feedback, scores, etc. So you want the marking to happen inside the actual assessment tool rather than directly inside the gradebook. That doesn't discount the fact that there are situations where we need to put things directly into the gradebook, and it's certainly possible. But the most common use case is you assess and mark within the assessment tool. The gradebook is more for those users that have administrative oversight of the gradebook. So ideally, we want less people in this space than what we had happening in Interact 2, where we had a lot of users potentially making changes directly to the gradebook. Not ideal. You'll notice as well that when we switch to this spreadsheet view that we're looking at, that the admin override option is where we're then able to put in those different flags on student submissions that you might be familiar with, like GP, AW, AE, etc. Those can all be adjusted here. And at that point, you need to understand that there is a hierarchy in terms of which columns are ultimately decide the student grade. By default, the scoring from student tasks will populate the final calculated grade and give the student their grade from HD through to fail for the subject. That is the most common setup. However, if a change was then made by the convener or school administration, etc., adjusting that final grade, this column, final adjusted grade, will override the final calculated grade, and this will be what gets transferred when we do our grade transfer. And then if a change has been made in the admin override section, like giving a student a GP, etc., that will override everything else. So this is at the top of the chain. Admin override will override the the adjusted grade, and adjusted grade will override the calculated grade. Does that make sense? There's kind of an order of priority. So for most students, they're just going to get what's coming through underneath final calculated grade. But if there are extenuating circumstances, etc., and things need to be changed, that might happen either in final adjusted or admin override. Either of those two will supplant what has been put into the final calculated grade. So we had a play with Ag 202. I think I'd like to go and play with another subject now in a second, but I can see, Kel, I may have a question happening.
Yeah, just a question from Rachel. So the satisfactory, unsatisfactory in the override going to be used instead of the other grading tools? So I talked about how to do this. We managed with the 1/0 rubrics.
Yeah, so look, the admin override is kind of a a creature unto itself. It's for school administrators to use for the overall subject, right? So it's got nothing to do with individual assessment tasks. I'm glad you've brought up satisfactory, unsatisfactory tasks, and that's exactly what I want to look at now. I'll show you what that is. This is called a drop box or a drop down where we have a number of options. They can be created, but that is not the default scenario for satisfactory, unsatisfactory tasks. So let's jump into another subject and we will look at exactly that. Not Ag 202. What about, let's have a look at this teaching and learning subject and see if it fits the bill. So first port of call, subject outline. Have they got satisfactory, unsatisfactory tasks? Let's see if I get lucky. Nope, they've got a 60 and a 40. Let's pick on a different one. Professional practice. I got a gut feeling that this might be one of them. We'll look at the outline. Satisfactory, unsatisfactory. Here we go. We got a heap of them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Oh my goodness. So what have I done? 7, 8, 9 satisfactory, unsatisfactory tasks. At least there's only one cohort. All right. So the good news is we've got a perfect example for us to look at with satisfactory, unsatisfactory columns. My expectation looking at the outline is there will be 9 columns waiting for me when I go into the gradebook. Let's open it up. I'm going to switch immediately to my manage grades view because there seems like a lot of scrolling happening there. All right, so here are my subject outline columns. I can see the cohort, the colon, and then the task names. Bathurst Distance Assessment 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Good. So there's only the one cohort, but there's 9 portals. We'll notice straight away that they are columns that are scored out of 1, which is how the subject outline will provision unsatisfactory, satisfactory tasks. If you've got one in your outline, it will come through like this as a numeric column scored out of 1. Now, the difference between a satisfactory, unsatisfactory task that sits in a subject that also has scored tasks is that we don't want it to count towards the final total in a subject that has other tasks with different values like 40, 60, 100, etc. We don't want it contributing to the final calculated grade in those types of subjects. But in this type of workplace learning subject where every task, in fact, is satisfactory, unsatisfactory, having it come through to the final calculated grade is not a problem. Because what we're going to look at here is that this type of column, the final calculated grade column here, if I go to edit it, I'm going to scroll down looking at the settings to look at the grading scale. And it has a grading scale which is called satisfactory. So what that means in this case is that the student needs to have achieved a 1 in each of those categories for this to show up in this subject as satisfactory. Inside a normal subject, the grading scheme that we have for the final calculated column is called normal, which is a HD through to fail continuum. When you have a subject where it only uses satisfactory, unsatisfactory tasks, this is going to be called satisfactory instead. And that means they have to achieve a 1 in each of those options to get this appearing as their final calculated grade. I may not have explained that particularly well. Maybe what we'll do is find a subject that has a standalone satisfactory, unsatisfactory task. Rachel, do you happen to have a subject code I might be able to have a peek at? Maybe?
Yeah, COM 248.
Perfect. I'll peek at the outline. Okay, 1 cohort, 1 task. Okay. So this I would expect to be the same type of setup that we just looked at. If I open up the gradebook now.
You're probably going to find not much set up.
Oh, that's
I've
all
got
right.
a meeting this afternoon to double check all of my stuff.
No problem. Look, the good news is you've got 1 column here
Yeah.
that is scored out of 1, and it is linked to somewhere in the assignments area. Either they're submitting something or whatever, but there's a submission portal. So it is linked correctly, which is
Okay,
great.
cool.
And what we're seeing here at this point is the final calculated is coming up as 1. And because there's no other scoring that gets associated with this, if I look at the properties for final calculated grade, this is no good to me, normal. There's no
Yeah.
HD through to fail for this.
Yeah.
It's got to be changed to satisfactory.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I had raised my service request, and I've got someone to talk to today, because when we were doing that, put it all in the master site and don't set certain things up and we'll deal with it later, I wasn't sure what things were being dealt with by whom. And so when I looked at everything and I saw how much wasn't dealt with, and that things were in very different states in different subjects, I thought I better get someone to just go through them all with me. So this is really helpful. Because
Okay.
I mean, I know what I need to go and look for and check now.
Yeah, this is what we're looking for really. When it's a subject that only has satisfactory, unsatisfactory tasks in it, the final calculated grade must be set to satisfactory as the grading scale rather than normal, because this would end up being a fail on a normal scale if they're getting a score of 1. Okay, so that part is good. The grading for this, just to match up with that, like we said, it's being scored out of 1. If we take a quick peek at the actual assignment that's been put in place, if I went to grade this task by looking at the submissions and I wanted to evaluate a student, it may not let me because of my role. Let's change this. Submissions. Okay, evaluate. Yeah, now we're talking. Right, so it's requiring that you come in effectively, as I'm guessing you're one of the evaluators, or you're in this subject, Rachel, you'd be coming in and putting a score out of 1. Now, your rubric currently is not scored. So this is a qualitative rubric, which means that you are manually typing in here 0 or 1. And that will flow through to the student where they will see in my grades satisfactory or unsatisfactory.
I don't think that's the intention. But I will tidy it up. I think that there's stuff that's happened when it's been ported through that's not quite as it should be.
Yeah, potential. I'm not. Oh, it is. It is
Yeah.
scored.
It's
Oh,
meant to be scored. So the thing is, all those things are there, and it's based on weight, but it's going to add up to 1 or 0.
oh, and it's currently got a value out of 100.
Yeah, this is
Oh,
what I
yeah.
was told to do 400 years ago when we talked about it. So what's problematic is that I'll have that meeting this afternoon, and hopefully we'll be able to sort all this stuff out.
Yeah, cool. That's an interesting one. Like basically, I mean, I'd need to know more about the task, but effectively it's saying that the student needs to get a satisfactory for every one of these things. And at that point, it's going to give full marks for
It's
it.
because
Yeah,
there are
okay.
several learning outcomes, so they actually have to be spoken to. It's a really bizarre. My understanding is that these probably should have been normally graded, but they were coded into CDAP as pass-fail.
Okay.
So we kind of got stuck with a bunch of learning outcomes plus.
Well, I mean, the end result's going to be fine because they can't.
Yeah, it's either it's one of 2 options. It's binary. You either get 1 or 0.
Yeah.
And I'm assuming that the weighting of it will either add up to them getting a 1 or a 0.
It would be very, I mean, you can basically check essentially if we're saying nah, but yeah. And yeah, oh no, I'm not a marker, so it won't do it for me. But you could go through and do that without saving it. And it'll show you the total at the end and what it translates to in the overall grade. So you can test that without any submissions from the student.
Yeah, but I would prefer it if we did have like a sandbox area where I had students that I could grade, fake students that I could grade. And I know I've mentioned this before because it is so important.
Yeah, potentially it might be something that they end up building into the training and support site, maybe, I guess. So. Yeah. Now, Matt's talked about looking at a subject that has a combined both satisfactory, unsatisfactory, and scored tasks. The good news is we can look at that in my training site because I have some of those. All right, I'm not going to look at subject outlines because I don't have one attached to this site, but I'm going to open up the gradebook directly and switch to the Manage Grades view. I have a lot of columns in here, so don't be thrown by that. But essentially, what I wanted to point out is some of these tasks. I'm looking for a satisfactory, unsatisfactory example. Right. So for example, in here, when you have a satisfactory, unsatisfactory task in a scored subject, you don't want it contributing to the final calculated grade, which means that you need to adjust the column so that this little box down here, exclude from the final grade center calculation, is checked. Once that's done, you're fine. It means that the task still gets graded and marked, but it is not going to push this number over 100. That's the short form of all of that. You make sure that your satisfactory, unsatisfactory tasks are not included in the final calculation. Sorry, go ahead, Matt. I've lost him. That's okay. I'll keep going. If you wanted to ask something, Matt, by all means, don't stand on ceremony, come off mute. Another scenario that we get with our grade books is to do with multiple items, usually quizzes, where the actual subject outline only has one item. So if we had, for example, somewhere that was called quiz items worth 10%, for example, or 30%, and I wanted to convert all of the scores from students in those different quiz attempts to that other value, there are two different ways that we can approach this. One of them is changing the individual quiz values, if it's nice and even, to a smaller value. So I'm not making much sense here. This feature that I have above all of the quiz items here is called a category. It's not a column, it's a container that a number of gradebook columns sit within. And you can create new categories by going up to new, and instead of item, which means column, we can create categories. And you can have as many of these as you like in the gradebook, but effectively it's going to be a container for other columns. So if I wanted to create a new category in my gradebook, and I might call it, for example, Assessment 2 Quiz Totals. At that point, what we can tell it to do, because the category itself will have a scored value, is I can tell it to, in fact, evenly distribute the value of every grade column that goes inside the category. That's one way of handling it. And I can actually tell it how much I want it to include or have each one of those columns be worth. So even if I had quizzes that are graded out of 100, but I only wanted each of them to contribute 2.5% to the weighting, I can change that in here, saying that each quiz is actually only going to contribute 2.5 towards the actual total value of the final calculated grade. Hit save and close. My category is now set up. It's probably sitting right down the bottom. A2 quiz totals. It's got nothing in it at the moment. Hence, it's worth 0. But if I wanted to allocate some of those quizzes we were looking at a minute ago, let's take some of these and put them in there. This will do. By editing the column, I have the option of choosing which category it sits within. So if I change that and put that within my quiz totals category, hit save and close. I scroll right down the bottom. You'll see now that my quiz totals column is now going to contribute 2.5 to the overall grade. And I can keep doing that with all the other quizzes. So if you've got a whole bunch of quizzes that are meant to add up to one particular total score, you can sit them all within a category and let the category modify what their output will be. Not sure if I'm explaining that particularly well, but this is one strategy for combining multiple assessment items where your subject outline only identifies one. So the students are going to end up seeing this quiz totals result. And in fact, if I wanted to, I could hide this column from the students so that they don't see these individual values. You can do that as well if you like. I'll stop there for a second. Have I lost the audience at this point, talking about gradebooks and categories and items? Or have you got questions around it? Or shall I go on? How do we feel about all that? Okay, Liz is okay with it. All right. Rachel.
Just on these categories, I was going through some of the site setup, and I think maybe while we were doing master sites and stuff and doing lots of workshops, there was one time where I had set up categories to separate out internal and distant cohort grades, and I didn't know whether that was okay. I don't know if there's some sort of prevailing wisdom on how we set these up, like if they're going to go up to a higher level and somebody's going to get all cranky because of some quizzical decision to organize columns.
No, there's no issue with it at all.
Right. Nice.
You create the categories to do what you want them to do. The only overriding rule is ultimately you want a value out of 100 to be coming up as your final calculated grade. That's the thing. Now, there are different ways that you might approach that. Some people have organized all of their assessment ones for different cohorts underneath one category called assessment one. And that way, they're still only going to get one score for that category, regardless of which cohort they're put in. But the final calculated grade is only fed by the category total, not by these individual ones. So, because this is pulling from whatever's inside it. So you'll notice that this value has dropped down to 398.5. Sorry, I'm going slightly insane. If I pulled another one of these quizzes in there, I expect to see that number drop down again. Let's have a look. Let's put it into the quiz totals down the bottom. Okay, so it's pulling my 2.5, 2.5. This category is now worth 5, and you'll see that it is continuing to adjust this amount. And then also we want to determine whether or not the quiz totals are feeding into the final calculated grade. I'll just check that. They're not excluded at this point. They're included. That's good. So it's taking 2.5 for each one in there and adding it in. So what you do with the categories is up to you, but they are one strategy that people will use to cluster either multiple assessment items where the subject outline identifies only one, or also to organize, Rachel was talking about organizing cohort submissions into a particular category. You can do that, but ultimately what it's going to do is give you a number in your managed grades view, like mine here, that it is higher than 100. That's not in and of itself a problem, as long as you understand that in most subjects, I'm going to show you another little part of your gradebooks here. Let's jump into this one, pharmacy. Up here in the top right-hand corner, there's a little button called settings. If you open this up, what you're going to see under this tab called calculation options is that the default setup for our gradebook is using points. Right, it'll add together points. It gives you a sample here of what they're worth, etc. But basically, it's taking the weighting for each task. We won't call it weighting. Let's call it the score, adding up to 100. That's fine until such time as you have the value for tasks not equating to their weighting. So if we have quizzes that are worth 100, but in fact their weighting is only 10%, one way that you can adjust this is by changing this setting from working with points to working with weights. I'll show you what this looks like. This is what I would consider probably advanced gradebook kind of understanding when you're starting to switch these around, but it does give you some real options. If we switch to weighted, so I think a lot of the LROs are already aware of how this works. You get a prompt saying you really want to change this over. Yeah, I really do. Once I close this now, what we're going to see is that we now have an additional column called weight. You've got points, which are now kind of irrelevant because we're dealing with weighting, and the weighting has to equate to 100. So this is where I could change a particular quiz, even though if this test was marked out of 100, I can change the weighting for it. Let's have a look. To be if the weighting for the quiz activity is 20%, 30%, 5%, you can change the weight as opposed to the score. So you can modify those if you're using weighting instead of points. But by default, we use points in all of our subject sites in our gradebook columns. So I know we've got Liz and Slav and others in here. And Rachel, does that make sense to you that when you might potentially want to use weighting instead of points? Yep. Excellent. So I'm going to turn this back. I won't leave the subject site in limbo, but basically either option, you want to make sure the result that you're getting out of it is set to 100. So I'll switch the calculation for this subject back to scoring points. But one strategy for dealing with discrepancies between the task value and the weighting is to switch across to weighted. Then you can actually put that in yourself. What else can I show you? Underneath, I want to say this is a setting for the final calculated grade column I want to look at. Let's have a look. Final calculated grade. Let's edit this. It's not in here, sorry. I'm in the wrong spot. This will make sense when I show it to you. There is a feature that is turned on. I think it's underneath calculation options still. If I scroll down, here we go. By default, the gradebook will not include ungraded items. So think of all those other cohorts and tasks that are not going to be applicable to Kelly Boone, the orange internal student, for example. This will not include them at all, just drops them all together from the final calculation. This is what's on by default. There is an option that doesn't get used very often, but potentially it will treat items as 0. I would only be messing around with this if you're in a single cohort subject, and probably be talking to an ED about when you might want to use it as well. But it's usually where you want, I don't want it not included in my value at the end, but I want it actually being graded as a 0 automatically. You can get it, get that setting in place. But by default, we don't include columns where that haven't been graded in that final calculation. All right, I've gone over time as I always do. So I will stop the recording now, but thank you for joining.